Good morning, Grace family. Excellent to be here with you, reading Psalm chapter 15 with you today, taking a look at another Psalm of David, and we'll also take a look at one other Psalm that has basically a similar quotation. So we'll do both of those sections today and talk a little bit about what the Psalm is specifically talking about, how it applies to us today. But I'm excited to be here with you on a Monday, and I feel like we're getting into a little more of a better habit and routine. And I apologize for those of you who enjoy having this brief moment, 15 minutes or so each day. I try to usually make it earlier in the morning so I can get out and do the stuff I do in the afternoon but sometimes that kind of just slips by like Friday. But let's go ahead and take a look at the text. Psalm chapter 15. So, who shall dwell in your holy hill is how it's been titled in my Bible. But let's start in verse 1. The Psalm of David. O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell in your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord, and swears to his own hurt and does not change, who does not put out his money at interest, and he does not take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. So that's it. That's all that's there in Psalm 15. And I say that's it, but there's a lot here. So it's really a massive contrast from the previous psalm, where we have an individual who's pictured in it saying to the psalmist, there is no God. And it's his response, David's response to that individual. Now here, we have a question of David asking, "Oh Lord, who will belong? Who's allowed to be? Who's allowed to be in your tent?" That is the tabernacle where the Lord lives. Who shall dwell on your holy hill, the place to which God has revealed himself? The psalm declares ultimately the desire to dwell with the Lord, to be with the Lord. And David, as the psalmist, says that only the upright will be able to sojourn in the tent of the Lord. That is what is concluded. We see that in verse 2, and he says, he who walks blamelessly and does right and speaks truth in his heart. That walk blamelessly, does what is right, speaks truth in his heart. Those are three specific aspects. One, walking blamelessly. This is your appearance before outsiders. To a certain extent, it is important that we not only actually do what is right, but we have the appearance of doing what is right to those who are around us. But then in the context, if you're just walking blamelessly, you could still be doing evil and people just don't know it. And that's why the next thing that David mentions is does what is right. So not only do you walk blamelessly, but you also are doing what is right. And I think this is important as we talk about even qualifications for elders and deacons and those kind of things, because we talk about that they're blameless. We recognize that the standard of doing what is right, and we'll talk about that a little bit, is an impossible standard, to do what is right all the time. And blamelessness carries the idea of that no one can bring a charge against you, because when you have done wrong, you've admitted that wrong, you've acknowledged that wrong, and you've confessed that wrong before others and before the Lord. But he's hitting with all barrels here. He says he's walking bliss person needs to walk blameless. They need to do what is right. And then look at this last piece. Speaks truth in his heart. This is also where not only are you doing what's right, are you walking blamelessly, but when you're in your thoughts and in the inner communication in your mind and in your heart, you're speaking truth and not lies. That you're not embittered against somebody, or you're not, any of those things. The matters of the heart, all of those things are true. Wow. Verse 2. I know some pretty great people. I don't know anybody like that. Verse 3, David continues, who does not slander with his tongue, does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up reproach against his friend. This is someone who does nothing against anybody else. Verse 4, in whose eyes a vile person is despised. Someone who is vile, doing evil, that you despise them. And so this goes back to the idea of that, not that you're necessarily going to treat them horribly, right? Because we're not going to slander, we're not going to do any evil, we're not going to take up reproach even against our friend. We're going to walk blamelessly, do what is right, and speak truth in our heart. But the reality is it's okay to look at someone and say what you're doing is vile, and that makes you a vile person. And that's exactly what David's saying here. In converse, he honors and honors those who fear the Lord. That you look at those who fear the Lord and desire his salvation and fear him, and you honor them. Who swears to his own hurt and does not change. So when you make a promise, when you make an oath and you commit to something that ultimately is going to bring about your own hurt or your own harm, you don't change what you said. You still do what you say you are going to do. Verse 5, who does not put out his money in interest. This is you lend without expecting anything in return. You don't take a bribe against the innocent. You're someone who you're always going to uphold the case of the innocent. You're not going to do anything wrong. And he says, he who does these things shall never be moved. Why will he never be moved? Well, because he's going to be perfect. He's going to be perfect in all the things that he's doing. And I think that is the people David recognized shall sojourn in his tent and dwell in his holy hill. And to think about that concept of who is authorized, who is allowed, and that's the kind of person. And I don't know those kind of people. Psalm 24 says something very similar. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear, sorry about that on the screen, there we go, who does not swear deceitfully. He will receive a blessing from the Lord, and righteousness will come from the God of his salvation. Interesting, his righteousness will come from God of his salvation. That's interesting right there, right? Even though these things are expected of this individual, his righteousness comes from God and not from himself. Verse 6, such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the Lord, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. And then we see Selah, just as a reminder in the Psalms, because this word does come up a bunch. The idea is lift up, to lift up your voices. This is a reverential term in the Psalter to ultimately to say, amen, I agree, yes, say it again. That is a true statement. And I, as a psalmist, listener, a cantor, or a responder, am in agreement. I think about this in the New Testament, and as New Testament Christians, we talk all the time about living in grace. But we have to understand we must never lax the standards of righteousness that God demands. We must never say, yeah, it's okay if you can meet the law, or it's fine if you can't meet the law, or it's fine if you sin. I don't like the phrase, it's human to sin, because it's not. God didn't create humans to sin. We chose to fall away from the perfection that God had created us in. And we chose to fall into temptation, into sin. And we now, certainly, because of the sin nature, it is ultimately the root. It's going to happen. However, one of us is going to fail. But we weren't created that way. It's not human to sin. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Christ actually is talking this very same thing. And this is the words of Jesus. Listen here. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not. I have not come to abolish them, but fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, I want you to understand this. I want you to understand this very clearly. The reality is when he says not an iota, not a dot, those are the two smallest, most insignificant portions of the Hebrew script. And sometimes that you might say, well, it's missing because someone forgot the dot. It's kind of like the dotting the I's and crossing the T's, only not so significantly. And he says that not a single one of those things will pass away until all is accomplished. So, what is his standard? Don't relax the least of these commandments. Don't relax the law. Don't reduce what we are doing. Ultimately, he says, verse 20, because unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Keep in mind, these are the most righteous people in their day. Now, we constantly look at them as as hypocritical, and because we know that how Jesus responded to them, because he knew their hearts. But in terms of their righteous actions before others, they were the top notch. They were the cream of the crop. And the reality here is what Jesus is saying is he's saying, unless your righteousness exceeds theirs, you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, you might be saying, whoa, Jeremy, that's not right. I mean, we don't get to heaven by our righteousness. And you would be absolutely right by saying that. But we can't shy away from what the scriptures clearly teach regarding righteousness. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14, Peter says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all of your conduct. Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on him as the Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from futile ways, inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. See, this is the idea, is that we are called to holiness. And Paul talks about this very same idea in Romans chapter 6. In verse 13, he says, don't present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you're not under law, but you're under grace. So now we no longer present our members, that's our bodies, that's our minds, that's the things that we have. We're not going to present ourselves as an instrument of unrighteousness. Instead, because we've been bought by Christ's death into life, we need to present ourselves to righteousness and doing righteous. Paul continues this idea in verse 19, and he says, and speaking in human terms because of your natural limitations, for just as you once presented your members as slaves to impurity, that is, when we were before Christ, when we were in the old creation, old body, we presented ourselves to sin. But let's continue. Impurity and lawlessness leading to more lawlessness. So now present your members as slaves to righteousness, leading to sanctification. That means becoming more and more like Christ. That's what we mean by that. We no longer submit ourselves to the old way of sin, but we submit ourselves to the new way of God. That's what we're talking about. In Romans chapter 10, verse 4, Paul's concluding an idea, and he says, for Christ is the end of the law for the righteousness to everyone who believes. This is the key here. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness. Now, we don't get our righteousness by following the law anymore. That's not how we get our righteousness. And that's the very same thing that's being talked about in Psalm 24, right? Is that he will receive a blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Right here. That's what this is talking about. That our righteousness has got to come from God because we can't get our own. Even the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, not sufficient to meet the task. And that's what Israel didn't understand. For being ignorant, in verse 3, right above here, for being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they didn't submit to God's righteousness. And the reality is that Christ is the end of the law for righteousness. We don't get righteousness from the law. We get it through Christ. But we don't stop there and get the righteousness of Christ and go, I'm all set. No, now we believe and we submit ourselves not to unrighteousness, not to sin. We submit ourselves to righteousness. Because if he bought us and he's called us, we should be holy. 1 Peter chapter 1, 14 through 19. So today, pray to God and ask how you might continue to pursue him. Pursue him in his holiness with clean hands and a pure heart. Confess your sins as he is faithful and just to forgive and cleanse you from all unrighteousness. Then walk as obedient children in the new life. That is what Psalm chapter 15 tells us for today. God bless you all. I hope you guys have a wonderful Monday. Take care.